Hey guys, welcome back to the channel and welcome back to Helldivers 2. Today we are going to be going through all of the armor passives that Helldivers 2 currently has and ranking them from worst to best in terms of how useful they actually are. Now, the armor passive abilities in Helldivers 2 are pretty important and are typically the basis where most people put their builds around, so knowing which ones are really good and knowing which ones aren't necessarily the best outside of specific situations can be very useful when putting together setups. Today we are going to go through all of the armor passives that are currently in the game as of now and ranking them from worst to best. Now, a couple things to note. First, Helldivers 2 is constantly adding a new armor passives with new war bonds or new collaborations or just new stuff coming out. So all the armor passives that I'm going to be talking about are as of this video's upload date. And if a bunch more come out, I will probably do another video about this later on. And second, keep in mind that this is just based off of my experiences and how I personally have used all of these armor passives and how I have learned which ones are effective in which particular ways. So without further ado, let's get on with the listing. So first up, we have the D tier of passives, in which we have two of them. And these ones are not necessarily the most useful outside of some very niche or specific strategies, and in some cases, they are practically worthless without these particular strategies in mind. And at the very bottom of D tier, we have Advanced Filtration. What Advanced Filtration does is it reduces the amount of gas damage that you take by 80%. Now, the reason why this is at the very bottom of the list is because there is not a single enemy in the entire game that actually does gas damage. The Bile Spewers, the Bile Titans, the Spore Chargers, those all deal acid damage. They do not deal gas damage, so this does absolutely nothing to reduce the amount of damage that you take from them. The only things in the game entirely that deal gas damage are actually the stratagems that the Helldivers have access to, which are the Orbital Gas Strike, the TX-41 Sterilizer, and the Dog Breath variation of the Guard Dog. So this passive essentially only exists to make it so that way you don't kill yourself if you are using a gas build, which in that circumstance, it works perfectly fine because it will make it so that way you are less likely to take yourself out from your own gas damage. But even with that, gas builds just aren't necessarily in a very good spot right now. They only have 3 stratagems that work with them. And again, outside of that, this doesn't do anything to protect you from any other normal enemies. So this is literally a dead passive if you are not using any form of gas build. And even when you are in that particular build, it's not going to be that effective because gas builds overall just don't have as much support as they want to have. Now, if they did make it so that way this reduced acid damage as well, that would make it significantly more powerful and make it a lot more useful, especially against the bugs. This would basically be a standard take if you are going up against the Terminant. But as of right now, it just really doesn't do a whole lot. And then also in D tier, slightly above it because it has a couple more applications, we have Electrical Conduit. Electrical Conduit is similar to Advanced Filtration in that it makes it so that way you take 95% reduced arc damage. Now, this is a little bit more useful, and I say a little bit with a very big asterisk next to it because the only thing that the enemies can throw at you now that deal arc damage is the Illuminate with their static Tesla towers. I was under the impression for a little while that the Overseers that the Illuminate have, their projectiles were arc damage and that this would help you take less damage from them, but that is actually not the case. Their weapons are considered energy damage. They're not considered arc damage, so this actually doesn't do anything to reduce the amount of damage you take from them. So similar to the Advanced Filtration, this essentially only exists so that way you don't take yourself out from your own arc damage using things like the Blitzer shotgun, the arc thrower, or the Tesla tower. Again, it is actually somewhat useful against the Illuminate just because they have Tesla towers, but you can also just sort of avoid them. You can just be very careful and mindful about where they are. And while arc builds are a little bit more effective and easier to use than gas builds, it's still not a incredibly meta or powerful setup to use. So that's why this is still in D tier. It's good in those setups, but it really just doesn't do much overall. So that is actually it for the D tier passives, and now we are moving on to the C tier, in which we have 4 of them. These ones are okay in their particular setups and builds. They have a little bit more usability than the previous ones, but they still are a little bit too niche, or in some cases just don't do enough to where they are nearly as useful as they want to be. And at the very bottom of C tier, we have Scout. Now, I know I just made a lot of people angry with this, but personally, I don't see Scout as being that valuable of a passive. What this does is it does 2 things. It makes it so that way enemies have a harder time detecting you, and that your map markers will release a radial ping that will reveal enemies. So talking about the reduced detection, what this does is it makes it so that way it reduces the range at which enemies can detect you by 30%. Basically, every enemy has an area around them where in which if you enter that area, you will then be detected and then they will find you. This reduces that radius for yourself by 30%, so enemies have a harder time finding you. Now, this part of the passive is actually pretty good, especially if you stack it with other factors that make it harder for people to detect you. For example, if you're on a nighttime planet, if you're crouching, if you're in dense foliage, you can basically become invisible to enemies and they can't find you, which in that sense, it's pretty decent. But the problem is that stealth in Helldivers 2, at least in my opinion, is not nearly as effective as people think. While yes, if you are by yourself and you're just the person going around getting loot, this is a very effective strategy. If you're with your teammates, which you want to be 90% of the time because that's how you're going to be more effective against big groups of enemies, it really doesn't matter if you're playing stealthy because you're going to be in the thick of a fight with your teammates anyway. Granted, it can help you sneak past some random waves of enemies if you are separated from your teammates and get back to them, so in that case, it can be pretty useful. But outside of those, it just doesn't really have a whole lot of effectiveness, especially once you get into the fight. And then the markers making a radial scan every 2 seconds just isn't really that useful. Yes, it's nice to let you know what enemies are nearby, but it's only if you're looking at the map. So unless you're pulling up your map in the middle of a fight, it's not really going to be that useful for you. And again, this only reveals enemies. It doesn't reveal loot. It doesn't reveal points of interest. It doesn't reveal any nearby locations. If it did reveal those things, or if it highlights the enemies in the actual world so that way you can see them easier, that would make this a lot more powerful and make this a lot more useful. But as of right now, it just doesn't really do a whole lot. It is good for a stealth build, but again, it doesn't do much outside of that. Then next up in C tier, we have Peak Physique. So Peak Physique has two different factors to it. It increases your melee damage by 100%, so you deal double melee damage, and it also improves your weapon handling for all of your weapons, so they have a little bit less drag. What that means is when you're moving around and shifting your aim, it takes less time for the reticle to catch up with your movement. So basically you can snap between targets a lot faster, which on the bigger, bulkier, unwieldier weapons, it actually does make a big difference and can make it feel a bit better. The extra melee damage on this is interesting because right now it's actually bugged. I don't know if they've fixed it yet, but as of the current moment, the perk is actually bugged to where it does not increase melee damage in the way that you think. There are a few melee weapons in the game right now, and essentially what the bug does is it makes it so that way if you press the right trigger or left click, whatever your fire button is, to attack with the weapon, you do not get the extra increased melee damage with Peak Physique. You need to press the actual melee button, which if you're on keyboard is F, if you're on controller, I don't actually know what it is, to do the quick melee action, which is the melee that you do with whatever weapon. If you have a rifle, you do a rifle butt. That melee attack is the only attack that gets the increased damage. So if you're using an actual melee weapon and just attacking normally, you don't get the benefit from this perk. Now, assuming that they fix that at some point in time in the near future, even in that sense, this doesn't necessarily do a whole lot. Yes, it is good for a melee build, which again, things like the bugs or even the voteless for the Illuminate can be pretty useful. But aside from those very niche circumstances, you're not really going to find too many enemies that you want to be in melee combat with. Yes, it's good for taking out smaller threats, but you have a lot of other things that are really good for taking out smaller threats as well. You're not really going to be using this against a Charger or a Hulk or a Devastator. You're not really going to be smacking those things too much, so this doesn't necessarily have a whole lot of value outside of just taking out smaller threats that swarm you, which again, you have a lot of different tools for that. Now, the improved weapon handling is nice, and again, for the bigger, bulkier weapons, this can actually help out a lot, so in that sense, it's pretty good. And again, if they fix the bug that this perk gives to where it doesn't benefit melee weapons as it should, it will be a little bit better, but I still think that there's just not enough enemies that are able to be attacked in melee range profitably to where this is a incredibly powerful perk. Now, next up in C tier, we have the Inflammable passive, which is similar to the Advanced Filtration and Electrical Conduit that we talked about earlier, where in which this gives you 75% damage resistance against fire. So it takes longer for you to be lit on fire and you take less damage from the fire. Now, the reason why this is in a tier above the other two is for two reasons. Number one is fire builds have significantly more support than gas and electric builds and have a lot more variety to them. So it is a lot more likely that you can run this and still get a lot of benefit from it. And second is there are a couple of ways that you can encounter fire damage in missions. If you're going up against the automatons, you can have the Hulk Scorchers. And if you're on a planet that has the fire tornadoes, this can help you out a lot. Granted, those are very specific threats. It can still help you out in that regard. And again, primarily this is just because fire builds are a lot more common and a lot easier to put together and have a lot more support to them. In essence, it's roughly the same as Advanced Filtration and Electrical Conduit, but the main difference is it just has more support. So that's why it's a little bit higher up. And then the final passive we have in C tier is Unflinching. This makes it so that way your character is flinched less when hit. This basically really only applies when you're being hit by ranged enemies, so this is a perk that is very effective when you're up against the automatons and to a lesser degree the Illuminate, and it actually does a couple of things that you don't necessarily think. It reduces the amount of recoil flinch by 95%, which is really good, so basically you will not get flinched or staggered when you're hit. It reduces the amount of camera shake when your camera would shake for whatever reason, and also an interesting thing that this passive does is it makes it so that way whenever your character does the maniacal crazy laughter after you've been firing for a certain amount of time, it makes it so that way that triggers 1 second sooner, so your character just goes crazy a little bit sooner. It's a fun little thing that doesn't do anything gameplay-wise, but it's a nice factor that it's actually included in this. It doesn't do anything, but it's also just very funny. So Unflinching is a somewhat decent passive that is really good, especially against ranged enemies. So again, versus automatons, this is a really, really good one. Outside of that, it doesn't really do a whole lot. The reduced camera shake and the extra recoil reduction from flinching, it can be very useful, especially when you are doing something like using a sniper rifle or using the anti-material rifle or what have you. And just being able to stay on target is very nice. The reason why I have it in C tier is because it just doesn't do quite as much as some of the other passives that we still have yet to talk about. It is still useful in its own right, and you can use this very effectively. It just, the other ones just do a little bit more. So then that's it for the C tier, and now we are moving on to the B tier passive. These ones are generally pretty good, while maybe not necessarily as powerful as the A or S tier passives. These ones you can still take in essentially any situation and be pretty confident that you'll make it through. And the first passive we have in the B tier is the Acclimated passive, which actually is from the Helldivers Killzone 2 crossover. What this does is it makes it so that way you have basically general elemental resistance. It gives you 50% resistance to fire, gas, acid, and electrical damage. So this basically takes all of the elements that we have seen before in some of the other passives and combines them together, although to a little bit of a lesser degree. Now, the reason why I put this a little bit higher than the other ones is because it protects against all of the damage types that you are primarily going to come across, especially acid is a very big one, and combines them into a nice, neat little package. You're going to be a little bit tankier against fire, against gas, against acid, against electrical. Again, gas you're not really going to have to deal with too much unless you are running a gas build, but fire, acid, and in some ways electrical, depending on if you're fighting the Illuminator or not, can be relatively useful. Although I believe with this, the Tesla towers can still one-shot you because the electrical damage resistance is not enough to prevent it from one-shotting you. But the fact that you just have a general resistance to every element is still pretty nice. And I think that once more enemies are released that are able to do elemental damage, or if they tweak it to where enemies do elemental damage, this will probably be a lot more powerful later on as well. And then the next one in B tier, we have Extra Padding. Extra Padding just makes it so that way your armor is a higher rating. So every armor that has this has 50 more points of armor, basically making it so that way it is the next tier up without losing any mobility. So if you have light armor that has extra padding, it has the same value as medium armor, just with the increased speed. If you have medium armor, it is the same as heavy armor. And if you have heavy armor with extra padding, you basically are a tank and have a ridiculous amount of armor rating. This is just a generally very useful one to have, especially since now they fixed it to where it actually applies properly. And it just gives you a little bit of flat damage resistance across the board, which is never a bad thing. And it's always going to be something that's useful. And what's extra good about this particular armor passive is it is widely available because this is included on the default armors that everybody has, as well as basically all the promotional armor sets and even a couple other ones that you can find. This is a very easily obtainable armor set that will just overall increase your survivability. Again, it's not flashy, it doesn't really do anything crazy, but it just straight up makes you harder to kill, which in essence is what you want your armor to do. And then the final armor passive in B tier is Democracy Protects. What Democracy Protect does is it grants you a 50% chance to survive any sort of fatal damage. So essentially, if you get knocked to 0% HP, there is a chance for you to just not die and just sit at 1 health. And what it also does is it basically prevents any internal bleeding if your chest is injured. If your chest gets injured normally, you are bleeding, which gives you damage over time, which can kill you. This basically prevents you from doing that. It prevents you from dying to that, which can be very useful in certain situations. This is obviously really strong because this gives you a chance to just not die, which is really, really good. The only real reason why this isn't B tier is because it's a percent chance. Granted, it's a 50-50 shot, but the fact that it is left up to chance is really the only thing that kind of holds it back. It is still a very powerful effect, and this is another armor passive that's similar to extra padding. You really just can't go wrong with running. The only problem is you're essentially taking a gamble of whether or not you will survive the fatal damage or not. But this has saved me personally many times, especially in the early game when I just didn't have a whole lot of the extra stuff. And it always feels good whenever you just eat a cannon shot from an automaton base and then you just walk it off with 1 HP, just absolutely flabbergasted as to how you survived. So, and then that is it for the B tier passives, and now we are on to the A tier. These ones are pretty good in just about any situation you can think of, and even in some cases can even be better than their current listings here. So then first up in the A tier, we have Servo Assisted. Servo Assisted does 2 things. What it does is it gives you 50% extra limb health, which makes it so that way your limbs are harder to break, which is actually very nice. And it also increases your throwing range by 30%. Now this applies to your grenades, also to your stratagems that you throw out. This can be very useful in a lot of different ways. First, the extra limb health is just very nice because it just means your limbs will take less damage. This does not apply to your torso and your head. I should mention that. It only applies to your arms and your legs, but it's still very useful because you are just going to get injured less, which overall is very nice. And the increased throwing range can actually be very beneficial in a lot of different ways. Not only do you have the ability to just yeet your grenades much farther, which in some cases can be very nice, but also your stratagems are able to go much further, which depending on which ones you take, can be incredibly useful. This basically means that you don't have to worry nearly as much about your Eagle cluster strikes killing your teammates. You don't have to worry about your HE barrages taking out your teammates. You don't have to worry about your walking barrages nearly as much. You can resupply much farther. You can reinforce your teammates much closer to where they died. There's a lot of different utility that comes with this passive that you don't necessarily think about. It allows you to engage enemies with your stratagems from much farther away. You can deploy turrets much further. That way there's less of a chance of you getting hit by them. You can send out the 500 kgs or the orbital lasers much farther away so they can take out whatever's over there. There's a lot of different utility that comes with this. And again, by making your limbs much more durable, your survivability is going up, which again is never a bad thing. So next up in the A tier, we have one of the newer passives with Siege Ready. What Siege Ready does is it increases your reload speed for your primary weapon by 30% and also increases the maximum ammo capacity for your primary weapon by 20%. So you have more reserve magazines for whatever your primary is, and it reloads faster. Now, an interesting point I should mention is that currently, as of making this video, this passive is actually bugged, and it not only affects your primary weapon, but also your secondary weapon and any support weapons that don't use a backpack. So if you have, say, the Stalwart or the machine gun or the head machine gun, all of those weapons still have a faster reload speed and more ammo capacity as well. So keep that in mind. Now, even if they patch out that bug, this is still a phenomenal armor passive to take. I cannot tell you how many times I've had to call in a resupply basically just because of my primary weapon. And your primary weapon more or less is probably going to be the main thing that you are running in terms of just enemy swarm clearing, unless you're running a particular sort of heavy support weapon type build, if you have a Stalwart or a machine gun or something. But in pretty much every situation you can think of, this is a phenomenal passive to run because it just gives you more ammo and it allows you to fling bullets out much faster, which again is useful in essentially any sort of setup you can think of. Again, while it is currently bugged at the moment, which makes it even stronger than it actually is, even without the bug, this is still a phenomenal armor passive and in my opinion is still worthy of A tier. And then the final passive that we have in A tier, which you could even argue this as being S tier depending on the circumstances, is Fortified. Fortified has 2 different factors to it. First, it reduces your recoil when crouching or prone by 30%, which makes it so that way when you're crouching or prone, your weapon is easier to control when shooting. That's just a phenomenal thing. This also provides you 50% resistance to explosive damage. Now, this is already pretty good because there's a lot of different enemies in the game that a percentage of their damage is considered explosive, such as the nursing and bile spewers attacks. Those are a percentage, at least, explosive damage. And even in those situations, it's really good. But where this particular passive really shines against is automatons. Against automatons, you could honestly probably argue that this is an S tier passive, but even outside of just fighting the automatons, this is still phenomenal. Having the extra resistance to explosive means that you are basically going to be able to take more damage from a lot of the bigger and badder threats. You're going to be able to absorb tank shots, devastator shots, Hulk shots, basically any sort of big burly automaton enemy, you're going to be able to eat significantly more damage from them. And the reduced recoil is also very nice to have, again, especially if you're running one of those very unwieldy weapons, such as the heavy machine gun or even just the normal machine gun. This can help out a lot with. So in essence, again, this is an A tier passive, but against the automatons, you could easily argue this as being S tier. And speaking of S tier, we are finally in the S tier, and these two particular armor passives, in my opinion, are just really good to run just in any particular mission. It does not matter what faction you're up against, what type of mission. These are just great passives to run. And if you're paying attention, you probably know which ones I'm talking about. So first up on the list, we have Engineering Kit. Engineering Kit has two different factors to it. It actually has the same recoil reduction that Fortified has, which is incredibly useful. And it also makes it so that way you can just carry 2 extra grenades. That is good in basically any situation you can think of. Just having 2 extra grenades, regardless of what types of grenades you're running, are very good. It means you can take out enemy spawners a lot easier. You just have more ordnance available to take things out quicker. If you have stun grenades, you have much more crowd control. If you have the thermite grenades, you can take out tough threats much more often. Just having access to more explosives and more ordnance is never a bad thing. And again, the recoil reduction is very nice, especially if you're running one of the more unwieldy weapons, as I mentioned earlier. And this just gives you so many positives with really no drawback whatsoever. And it's also a very common armor passive that you see on a lot of different armors. So it is also readily available for basically everybody to use. And then the final top tier of S tier, at least in my personal opinion, is Medkit. Medkit makes it so that way you can hold an additional 2 stims so you can heal more often, and it also increases the stim effect duration by 2 seconds. So when you take a stim and it heals you, it makes it so that way it heals you faster and longer. This is beyond valuable. First of all, just being able to heal more often just gives you more survivability, which is never a bad thing. And the increase to the stim effects is incredibly valuable, especially depending on what the rest of your team setup is. A couple of interesting things about this. One, if you have the P11 stim pistol, this actually applies to that as well. The stims that you fire out with that actually gain bonus effects as well, which is really nice. And probably the most powerful thing with this is if you have the experimental infusions booster from the Viper Commandos Warbond. This makes it so that way, in addition to restoring health, your stims also temporarily give you more movement speed and damage reduction. And if you have Medkit, it extends the effect of the increased speed and damage reduction, which is very, very powerful. Even outside of that, though, the fact that you just heal more over time is great because it allows you to outlast certain damage over time effects such as gas and fire and actually be able to survive if you take a stim fast enough. But even aside from all of that, even if they took that away and just said, hey, you carry 2 extra stims, that would still be phenomenal because it just means you get to survive more. You get to heal more and you are going to be out there for longer, which, as much damage as a lot of things can do and as much extra utility as a lot of these passives can do, keeping you alive is probably the most valuable thing possible because you can't do any of this stuff if you're not alive. That's why I say personally that Medkit is the most powerful and best of the armor passives to date. Well, there we have all of the different armor passives for Helldivers 2 as of now. Again, as more passives come out for the game, I might do another video about this later on. And again, they will probably change some of these or tweak some of them at some point in time. But let me know how you guys like this. I know it's a little bit different. I don't normally do a whole lot of Helldivers content, but this is one I've been wanting to do for a little while. Let me know what you guys think, and let me know if you want to do any more tier listings of any of the other stuff in Helldivers. Maybe the boosters, maybe the weapons, maybe the warbonds themselves. Let me know down in the comments. I like hearing what you guys have to say. Anyway, I hope you guys found this video informative and entertaining. If you did, please be sure to let me know by hitting that like button and consider becoming a member and subscribing today, as it really helps me out a lot. For Super Earth Helldivers, I'll see you in the next video.